Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Standing Up Against Racism. This is a feature from the Vancouver Island Human Rights Coalition. We're joined here today. We have a panel, and we're excited. I don't know about you, but I'm excited. We're going to be talking about how we can stand up against racism in today's society, especially within the lens of the youth. So to begin, first and foremost, we want to acknowledge and respect the lands in which we're on. We're situated on the Lekwungen-speaking people's territory, the unceded and ancestral territories, and the Esquimalt, Songhees, and Wasanish-speaking peoples. And especially when it comes to territorial acknowledgements, I think oftentimes people limit it to an acknowledgement. It has to be ingrained in how we move, we speak, we talk, and exist within society. And we'll never be able to address systemic racism if we cannot address the historical and current issues plaguing our communities. So with that, I also want to mention and stand in solidarity with those folks within the Asian and Pacific Islander communities experiencing hardships during these times, especially during this pandemic, facing hate, violence, and racism. So that's something personally I want to share and to mention because, our liberation is linked, and so it's important to uplift that. So okay, a couple of ground rules for our panelists today. I want to make sure that we're taking a trauma-informed perspective into our conversation. So if you feel triggered or don't feel comfortable answering a question, it's okay. Prioritize your well-being first and foremost. And not all the questions may apply to you, so just know your silence is also okay today. So I just want you to feel comfortable. This is a conversation about us, for us, and to educate those listening. So the Vancouver Island Human Rights Coalition is a community-based non-profit agency located on the traditional territories of the Lekwungen-speaking peoples, also known as Victoria, BC. And here we help individuals and organizations promote human rights through advocacy, support, and human rights education. So if you feel like you had felt discriminated against or unfairly treated for whatever reason, feel free to contact their advocates. You could send them an email or call them. You could also reach out to their website, which is viher.com, or follow them on Facebook, Instagram, or newly Instagram and Twitter as well. So let's kind of hop right into it. All right, I'll pass it off to you, Nikisa. Tell me a bit about yourself and how did you arrive on Lekwungen territory, also known as Victoria, BC?
Yeah, I arrived on the Lekwungen territories in 2015 in my pursuit of following my rugby dreams of going to the Olympics and joining the Canadian Sevens team. So I arrived here and completed 1 year at UVic. And then from there, was integrated into the Sevens program and have been here ever since. And now I'm still training for the 15s team and working at Aptawala, which is a small rugby apparel business. But yeah, I was fortunate enough to meet amazing people like Pam. We played on the same team together for about 4 years and have met some amazing other community members through rugby, which has been great. It's kind of led to having these conversations as well.
Nice. Pass it off to you, Rain.
Hey, hi, my name's Rain. And I was born in Victoria, so I've been here my whole life. But I'm Kwakwakiwak from the Namgis Nation of Alert Bay, and then also Lekwungen from the Songhees Nation here in Victoria. And my parents came, so my mom came from Alert Bay, which is up island, and my dad came from Kinkum, which is also up island. And then they sort of migrated here, and that's how my family came to be on these territories.
Nice. And last but not least, Selma.
My name is Selma. I've lived on Lekwungen territories basically my whole life. I moved here when I was really young from the States, actually. So I was one of the co-organizers for the people's protest that happened in Centennial Square, and I also spoke at multiple rallies that were held throughout the city. So.
Yes, nice. Yeah, I think for myself, my name is Pam Finette. My pronouns are she, her. I arrived here also to follow my dreams, play rugby, and go to school as well. That's what I told my parents. And yeah, it's great to see youth here doing things in community and involved. So what types of conversations are going on in schools or on your teams or even with your family and friends when it comes to race and racism?
I go to York University, and I'm currently enrolled in the BFA Dance and Choreography program. And one conversation we had recently was with one of our professors, Sarita Hector, and she debuted her work called Black Ballerina, which was about the disparities of Black skin and pink tights and shoes, which is a big conversation in the ballet world. And I also previously went to Vic High, which is a place where I could really share my voice through dance in the dance program. So I feel like we have all these spaces and places where we're given space to talk. And sometimes I do find though that it's sort of coming from my end, or I'll push the conversation. So I think I'm given space, but sometimes it doesn't come from the other side, I think. But I'm also always in conversation with my family. I recently did interviews with some of the residential school survivors and intergenerational survivors for a school project. And it really opened some doors for me and new ideas and concepts that I hadn't previously thought of. So in my family, that's sort of an ongoing conversation.
Mm. Yeah, that's powerful, especially I really echo that, especially when it comes to um, giving, but then people just limiting to just taking on whatever traumas that you provide. And it's oftentimes when people share, it's to share so that conversations continue to actually formulate into action. So I totally feel with that, that oftentimes we limit our extent of activism to conversations. But as you were mentioning, it goes beyond that. Kisa?
I think like with some of the current members on the Sevens team, you included in Charity, I think you guys have definitely pushed for the rugby community to have conversations around racism. And I think that has been very helpful. And I think it's been a long time coming, but there hasn't really been conversations with entire teams up until really 2020. But it definitely is uncomfortable, but yeah, like I know being on the 15s end of things, I know you guys are still spearheading a lot of these conversations and making it a more safe place to be uncomfortable. And just like, I think I've seen a lot of different people educating themselves and getting to a place where we can have these conversations, which has been really helpful. So yeah, it's kind of it's encouraging that it's happening, but it kind of saddens me that it's taken this long. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that's such a strong emphasis, is that discussions about racism has happened since the beginning of time. Injustices, social justice, things of that sort has been an issue. And for a lot of people of color, racialized people and people in various disenfranchised communities, this has been our realities. And so now people are listening. Now people want to hear from what our experiences are and the so-called, situations that we've been in. And oftentimes it's, microaggressions, and then other times it's, systemic issues that has now plagued the ways in which we move in society. So I completely, that's a very strong point, Nikisa. Selma.
I've had a lot of conversations with like family members and like close friends, definitely a lot of healing together. Speaking out our grievances with people we love is definitely important. Healing together with the people we love is definitely an important step when it comes to discussions, because if you're not having those discussions in your own home, how are you supposed to have them outside? Mm-hmm. So definitely getting a lot of perspectives from, for example, my mom, She came from Somalia a long time ago, and I got to learn a lot of her experiences, and I got to learn a lot from my friends and a lot from you, obviously. Learned a lot from different people. Definitely met so many people from so many walks of life, and learned a lot, definitely. So it's very important we have these conversations.
And that's such a strong point, that if you're not able to have those conversations behind closed doors in the private, in the public, how can you actually be intentional in the ways in which you show up? And I think another strong point that you mentioned was that, the POC, people of color's experience is not the same. We're not the same. We're not all the same, right? Oftentimes people say Black community, Indigenous community. We're various. We are not monolithic in our experience. And that's why it's also important that when people are looking to be an ally, is to listen to what the needs are. If you want to show up for someone, listen to what their needs are. And obviously there's elements of education and understanding, but if you have a close connection with someone, it becomes easier to listen to what their needs actually are. So when it comes to that educational component, do you think that the educational system, so from wherever schooling you did, should change to introduce concepts around diversity, inclusion, equity, race, and racism?
I would say yes and yes, but I noticed that often when they bring these concepts into our education, it's sort of introduced in other spaces. But I feel the real work is bringing those ideas of inclusion and equity into the white dominant spaces. So for example, in my dance program, we have other spaces outside of our primary curriculum, like African dance and Philippines folk dance, or there's a day where Indigenous choreographers come in to showcase their work. And I really do value these opportunities, but I don't think it's so much about, oh, we have Black students, so let's offer African dance so they can feel safe and included. I think the invaluable work is going to be in how can we get the Black, Indigenous, and students of color to feel that same sense of pride, safety, and inclusion in a ballet class where traditionally Eurocentric ideals are celebrated. I think that's where the work is, and I don't need any more other spaces. I get plenty of that in the real world, so that's my thought.
That's a very strong point, is that oftentimes, wow, that was really I think that's so true, because oftentimes when people there's these concepts that are introduced, and it's oftentimes in a segment. Like we oftentimes bring it, it's like we're going to present these concepts in this space, but why can't we talk about it in the dominant space, which is oftentimes filled with white supremacist ideals already ingrained within it. So when we're, for example, learning about math, why can't I learn about different forms of math? And when we're talking about philosophy, why is it that when we're presented elements of philosophy, we only learned about people of color at the end, or only a segment of it, right? Is how can we integrate people of color within history, within knowledges, within experiences, because we're here and we've always been here, and it shouldn't just be separate, but it should be ingrained within the ways in which we understand and show up. Nikisa?
I totally agree. I think, at least when I was in high school, which is a couple of years ago now, it was always like an elective. It's like, it's a choice for like students that want to learn more about different cultures and different ways of learning. And I don't think it like should be necessarily a choice. I definitely agree with you. I think it should be like ingrained in the way we learn and the way we approach these topics. Yeah,
I agree. And when it comes to that option of opting out, I think that's also a testament of society, is the option of opting in when everybody's posting a black square, but opting out when it comes to showing up for someone who's experiencing a microaggression or experiencing an issue that is addressed because of who they are and what they look like. And I think that opt out is an issue when it comes to showing up and and having that community care. Because when it's an elective, if it's an option, people don't do, people opt out of helping and even potentially saving someone's life. Selma?
I totally agree with all of your points. I feel as though we don't see a lot of POC representation in education only because they almost feel uncomfortable, like the education system almost feels uncomfortable to approach these topics because maybe they aren't as educated in said topics. So definitely we need to introduce some sort of training for teachers and people in the education system because kids are in school majority of the time. So it's better to learn from your teachers rather than learning it in some space that they've made for you. So it definitely should be ingrained in our education system.
And that's such a strong point, is that the integration of knowledge should be made so that racialized students can learn, and also non-POC students can also learn in a way that's like almost not necessarily standardized, but in a way that can reach people, right? We shouldn't be learning about injustices just simply through the media, but don't have a space at school where most of the time students are, because it's not in the curriculum. That should be a huge part of the curriculum, is to have these spaces. So in light of COVID-19 and the fact that obviously racism and all these other things are still continuing and have not stopped, how can youth right now, today, stand up against racism, either by preventing it or after it happens?
I guess this is a challenging question because with COVID, engaging in like the proactive, critical conversations is happening a lot less in person. And I think when we do get the chance to engage online, it can be really fatiguing or tiring. But my bias answer is storytelling. Through COVID, storytelling has been my way of standing up against racism. As I share my stories about the orcas or my family's history, my worldview has a chance to really be seen. And I think it's that thought-provoking, innovative dance storytelling that I find sticks with people. Even if it's one person who my story really hit, I think that's an accomplishment. But storytelling is a pretty integral part of my life and my culture, and I understand that not everybody has that exposure or that knowledge yet, the power of yet, or just the space to actively be doing this work in their community. So I guess my other suggestion is listening, because listening does not have to be passive. For me, it means respecting the stories that I'm being told. And if I've listened to, say, the Namgis Nation's plea to stop fish farming, I'm going to enact that listening and maybe not buy farmed fish. And another point is that I think stories require like 3 parts. So like the storyteller, the listener, and the story itself. And it's that in between, that gray matter in between the teller and the listener, that the meaning is born, that the story is right there in between. And if you're an active engager in that story process, you will get a lot out of it. And then maybe one day be on the other side, being the teller.
I find that such a important piece, is that listening doesn't have to be passive, right? I think oftentimes we limit our capacity to listen to hearing, and it stays there. And I think the more we can transcend the passive and move into the active is when things can be changed, right? We are enacting, we're being a part of the change. And so it's not simply about hearing someone's story. It's not simply about being around, the movement. Is with that information, how are you uplifting and empowering that story that you've been exposed to, right? It's that enactment of the information to actually do it, to do the work. And I know that that's such a thing as do the work, but it's a thing, if you want to do the work, you have to listen. And that's such a strong piece, is that listening does not have to be passive. That's a choice. You know, you opt out if you choose to be inactive. Gisa?
That was honestly, yeah, I really agree with Rain, and I think listening is so important. I also think that it's important to now, with the spaces that are created and having these conversations, like when you are having a conversation with someone, not being afraid to stand up for what you believe in and having like the space to correct them when you know it's not right. I know like in the past I felt like silenced or like I couldn't say what I needed to say even though I knew what someone was saying wasn't right. But I think now, especially as everyone's coming together through social media, I think that it's important to, I guess, nip those like microaggressions in the bud and just kind of really stand up for yourself and also people of color, whatever the conversation was about.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I think that's such a strong point in the sense that, you know, it doesn't have to just be, you know, racialized people having to stand up. It's on everybody. You know, white supremacy affects us all, obviously in different ways, but the ways in which you choose to perpetuate it or to dismantle it is very different, right? If you choose to be silent and not nip it in the bud, and knowing that you have the power and privilege to do so, you're a part of the problem, right? Silence is violence. So when you don't challenge it, if you see someone can't or doesn't have that voice or can't show up, that is when we have to stand up. If you have that energy, that courage to do it, because people's livelihoods depend on it. Selma?
Since there is a pandemic going on, I feel as though we should be looking within ourselves, also doing self-reflection, using the resources that we have been given to just educate ourselves even more. Social media is such a powerful thing that we basically have all the information we need at our fingertips. It doesn't replace having face-to-face dialogue with somebody, but it does do something, definitely. Mm-hmm. Having those internal dialogues and checking yourself, basically. So
yeah, and I think when you check yourself, you're able to show up, right? That's why when we do, you know, a territorial acknowledgement, you acknowledge where you're at. When you situate yourself by checking yourself, by knowing your positionality within a circumstance, it becomes easier to be an ally because you know exactly where you stand, right? So when it comes to having these dialogues and how dialogue is now in different forms, when we talk about social media, for example, there's different ways that we can have those communication forms, especially today in COVID. So now that we obviously know we're in the age of social media, some would argue that clicktivism, so for those that don't know, clicktivism is activism by clicking. So some would say that's not real activism. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, I believe social media is a really great way to spread information. I mean, a lot of the movements I follow, I get a lot of information from online and through social media. And it's also a place that I can share information with others about my activism. I mean, even this conversation is being shared and held online through social media. But I'm sorry, there's like music playing in the background, so if you can hear it.
It's okay. It's okay. We're all here. We're all good.
But I have a hard time with collectivism. I think it's definitely can be an act, but I'm not sure about the vism part. Because activism for me means being a part of community, engaging with community members, telling stories, hearing stories, living in stories, and earning and learning respect. Like I post about orcas a lot, but I'm also researching their stories, reading books about them, telling stories from my people, investigating my role in our shared future with them, and learning each day to respect them as beings. And I can't do a lot of that online. And I think collectivism can lead to sort of the pat on the back activism where we feel good after sharing something or reading an article. And I think it's very easy to feed that narrative that the activism is done when we feel good, but the activism isn't done until BIPOC people are fairly represented or can feel safe and stop facing that violence that these colonial systems are throwing onto us.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And that's so true, because when, yeah, activism does not stop when you feel good. And I think we saw that tremendously when it was the Black Square, the hashtag Black Lives Matter, the hashtag Stop Asian Hate, hashtag Me Too, all these, hashtags and things that, go viral and of course spread the news, spread awareness. With the murder of George Floyd, I felt like for me personally, it was, the visual, it was very graphic. And I think, yes, it spreads information. Yes, we see, and I think that component of seeing and obviously a very ableist notion of when you see, you believe. I think when we do nothing with those visuals, with those stories, with that understanding, and we simply do the bare minimum, then you have stopped the momentum, right? When you just show up, and that's limited to how much you want to give and to be active in your activism, that's when also the harm is done, because you have now all this information that you have chosen to opt out to execute. Kisa?
No, I totally agree. And sometimes I feel like it's, like Rain said, kind of like a pat on the back, or like, checking it off the list. Like sometimes I just would hope it's not a repost of a story or a post without actually doing the research behind it. And I think that sometimes takes away from the people and the movement, because there's actual maybe no knowledge behind what's really going on, or what's the cause of this, or how it's affecting the people that are in your life or other community members that you're not surrounded by. But yes, I do kind of struggle with it as well, social media in general, but just how, I think it is great that it can spread information, but sometimes I think it is kind of used as a pat on the back, or kind of checking off.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I think with that, it's almost like people can commodify people's experience, right? With the click of a button, you've now spread, gained, and also exploited, right? There's that potential of exploiting if you do nothing with that. And I think it's that buzz feeling of, now you have this information, you're sharing it, cool, you're doing the work, yada, yada, yada. And that's the extent of it. And I think, yeah, it's like there's that fine line of sharing to show and sharing to do. And I think that's oftentimes the thing that's the biggest disconnect for a lot of people, is how far are you actually willing to go? When we talk about decolonization, when we talk about land back, when we talk about systemic racism and dismantling things of that sort, how far are you willing to go? And is it going to be the click of a button and that's your solution, or are you going to do something with what you can do? Selma?
I totally agree with all of your points. With Rain saying collectivism, it's a hard topic, only because social media is so prominent now, and we are able to share so much information just in a second. In a split second, you can access so much information. But I think it's important that what we do with that information, for example, a lot of misinformation can be spread so easily. Someone can make a post with the wrong information and it can quickly turn viral. And also, social media can be used to almost hurt a cause. Example, the Black Square. When people are posting Blackout Tuesday, they would also hashtag with Black Lives Matter. And with the Black Lives Matter hashtag, all you would see was Black Squares, and it would cut out all the rest of the information that people would maybe be looking for and would not see because of the Black Squares. So it can definitely be utilized in a positive way, but it also can be utilized in a negative way. And also, we can utilize it positively by engaging in online dialogue like we are now, or mobilizing online so we can mobilize in real life. So it's definitely very it's difficult, but yeah, I don't know. Collectivism is definitely a hard topic to talk about.
For sure, for sure. And I think with and such a strong point is to be able to mobilize beyond the virtual, right? Is to be able to shake people so that they move to the physical. And I think that's oftentimes, the battle with collectivism is, how far are we willing to go? How far are we willing to shake things up? Because it's true, there is algorithms in play for you to be exposed to what you like, right? There is, and for me personally, I found that I remember I was in another country which had very opposing views, to say the least, and I was almost shocked and disappointed in myself for not knowing that someone who's not that far away from me can have a completely opposing view from me. And the inability of communicating, and I think that's also a testament of COVID-19, that we have to be distant socially and physically and in many different spaces, is that it was almost like someone who's obviously very engaged and cares a lot about what people think and how they feel and how we can move forward as a community. If I don't know what the opposing ideas are, who am I fighting for? Who am I fighting against? What am I fighting against or for? And how can we have a collective conversation where I can see eye to eye, where we can have that community care? And it's not to say that we'll have the same perspectives. It's not to say that we're going to agree, and some people completely disregard my entire existence, that's just a thing as well. But I think it becomes dangerous when we only talk to our only echo chambers, we only talk to those who think like us, is that in order for that activism to be active, is for us to lock into the brains of those who are against that idea or have not even tapped into that idea of thinking. So when it comes to thinking and the construction of it within our society, we see laws. And in BC, there's laws to protect against discrimination based on race, gender, discrimination, and that's called the BC Human Rights Code. So if someone is treated badly or differently based on whatever intersection they're in, that's called discrimination, as you probably know. And people are protected from discrimination in workplace, when renting property or purchasing a house or whatever services. But despite the laws, as we know, racial discrimination, hate crimes, violence, oppression still persist in British Columbia, Canada, and beyond. So what actions do you think are missing or not working well enough when discussions about racism occur?
I think that what's missing in a lot of these conversations is the engaged, embodied experiences that are needed to talk about racism. When we learn about things like food safety or first aid, we have to physically, emotionally, even spiritually engage in that content, because the things we're learning about are embodied, tangible things, and so is racism. So I don't think we can learn about it by simply hearing that it's real. There was recently a presentation in one of my classes about race and privilege, and the gist of the conversation was that racism was real. Well, yeah, but how can we be a part of the learning and get involved? And so this is something that I like doing with dance. And I was talking with my mom about when I tell Indigenous stories with a cast of primarily white dancers. I asked her, is it okay to have non-Indigenous people telling these stories about missing and murdered Indigenous women or residential schools or whatever the topic is? And she kind of came back with this really interesting point. And she says, aren't these the people who should be putting their neck out on the line to have these stories heard? Isn't it good to have non-Indigenous people in the work, maybe even uncomfortable, and immersing themselves in these stories? And so, yeah, that's what I feel. I really like bringing people into the process. So I think what's missing is that holistic experience in learning about racism, because I don't think it's just a textbook topic. I think it's something we really have to engage in. It affects us in so many different ways. So yeah.
Mm-hmm. And that's such a strong point that you mentioned is, Nikisa, you're gonna be mad at me because it's always in rugby that we say is being uncomfortable. And I mean, especially like being an athlete and constantly having to run a lot is being uncomfortable. And there's so much growth that comes with being uncomfortable. When you do put your neck out on the line, when you make a mistake, when you learn and have the opportunity to grow, that is one step forward. And I think oftentimes when you think about how does one be an ally, how do you challenge racism, oftentimes it's limited to, I don't want to make a mistake. I don't want to. If you move with intention, you do your research, you center racialized voices at the heart of what you're doing, you decenter whiteness. And I think James Baldwin said it very strongly, is that whiteness is a metaphor for power. When you decenter that power and uplift and empower those who, are not a part of the conversation or completely excluded from the conversation altogether, that's when we can have change. That's when it's worth it, and we're all working together, and that allyship is meaningful. Because oftentimes I think when I hear is like the discomfort is I don't want to make a mistake. I don't want to. Why not? Because when you don't, I'm still in the trenches. I'm still going through it, right? And that's why it's plagued our communities. That's why it's been since the beginning of time, the people of color, people who use substances, people who are sex workers, people who use substances, oftentimes are not afforded the care, are not afforded the opportunity to be in conversation, to be in community. And so when we can be uncomfortable and learn and extend a hand, that's when change and that growth comes with uncomfortability, but that's when things happen. Kisa?
No, I think that's great. And yeah, the saying, being comfortable with being uncomfortable, is very much ingrained in you and I. And I think that it is super important, like you said, to do the education and do the work to kind of see the other perspective when we're having these conversations with people that maybe have different views than us. Why do they think that way? Where does that stem from? And I think that can allow for a healthy conversation, I guess, to have, because I read this thing where it says when you receive information that goes against what you've believed in, you receive it as almost like physical trauma, and I think it takes time to continue to have these conversations and also know where they're coming from as well. And obviously you can't do that forever, but I think that having those healthy conversations and seeing both sides of the story is important to really create progress.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And that's such an important side. An important part to mention is that when you understand the story, and I think oftentimes when we talk about whose story is the dominant story, because oftentimes when we hear about history, when we learn in our textbooks, I remember in the schooling that I had, I didn't really learn much about a lot of the indigenous communities after I graduated, right? I didn't hear because it wasn't a part of the story. Their voices was not the center of what was happening. So it's important when we're talking about the sides of the story is whose side is not even there, whose side is not even considered in the discussion, whose side am I only presented with, what side am I only taking on? And that addresses the biases, that addresses the that like someone was talking about, like understanding and checking yourself, is understanding what side am I on. Have I been silent and perpetuating the violence, or have I been loud, talking, sharing, and continuing the momentum to have that conversation? So it's important to know also, with knowing the sides, is knowing what side have you been on and have been only been exposed to. Selma?
You guys hit it right on the head. But what I will add is, when we are having these conversations, I think it's important to understand why we're having the conversation. Like, we're not having the conversation because we want to prove someone wrong. We're not having the conversation because, oh, I'm right you're wrong, shut up, right? We're having the conversation because we want to invoke change. We're having the conversation because we want to have a thoughtful dialogue with each other. So first is having a reason for that conversation. And as you guys said, we need to get comfortable with discomfort, because when we're talking about especially racism, it makes a lot of BIPOC individuals very uncomfortable. Talking about our experiences does make us uncomfortable, and definitely when another party who hasn't experienced the things that we have, it'll definitely make them uncomfortable too. So it's important that to invoke change, we get comfortable with having our ideas challenged, so that we're able to grow not only as people, individuals, but as a community and in a whole, basically.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I think that's important when it comes to, I think Rain had mentioned it, is like when someone shares, it's not just taking, it's not just exploiting, the trauma that you've received, that you've heard, like, oh, I've heard this sad sob story and now I know. That's not how it works. Is now that you know, that's impacted the way you think, the way you feel, how are you going to channel that energy to now uplift them, even when they're not there? How am I going to show up for you when you're not in these spaces? And I think it's important when it's like when you have different perspectives, you listen, is to, again, who are you doing this for? Why are we here in the first place, right? Is understanding that when you're centering or decentering whiteness, you're decentering and destabilizing power, that we're allowing for different forms of power to showcase itself, right? I think, oh goodness, I feel like I'm being a professor here, but Foucault mentioned, like knowledge and power, and the parallels to that is that when we decenter, the main sources of power, the dominant, and destabilize that and introduce different forms of knowledges, different forms of storytelling and experiences, that's when we challenge and have a more holistic understanding of one another. And it comes down to each other. It comes down to me knowing how you feel and being able to tend to that and providing that care. So racism is a part of some communities and institutions' psyche. A segment of our community holds overt racism views, and a larger segment has subconsciously operated with biases and having negative stereotypes, right? Sometimes even within our institutions, even the criminal justice system, reflect and perpetuate those negative stereotypes. When we look disproportionately within our incarceration systems, when we look at the foster care systems, when we think about different structures that oftentimes are overlooked, there's a disproportionate representation of certain bodies. There's a disproportionate representation of those who have oftentimes been disregarded within structures and systems altogether. And I think when we look at it as face value, we're like, well, these people are probably this way. But when we take a macro lens and look at how the structures and the institutions have probably not provided that care, then that becomes a collective responsibility, is to challenge these criminal justice systems, to challenge how these structures are set up, right?
I just wanted to add on that topic because it's something I recently talked about with my uncle, Alex Nelson, who's a residential school survivor, about the foster care and the criminal justice system, which is a new idea that I had not previously considered. Because when I thought about residential school and intergenerational effects, I only ever really considered the people, right? Like there's all these people who have been affected. But those intergenerational effects also trickle down into the system, which is something I hadn't thought of, that you don't just say residential schools are done, it's over. And to paraphrase, it's basically that the residential school system has not totally ended yet. When you think about how much money all these industries make off of Indigenous children, well, where does that come from? Why are all these children in foster care or child and family services, agencies, schools? Like, that is the system that has been upheld in Canada, only ending 24, 25 years ago, that is still trickling down into the system. And then another note I just wanted to put on the criminal justice system was how sometimes it can be really ineffective in the way that these colonial systems choose to punish people. So my uncle, he shared with me in residential school about some of the punishments that the schools inflicted on them, and how there comes a point where you don't know it's a punishment, you just think it's a way of life. And so in the criminal justice system, if you don't know what punishment is, how is being sent to jail all the time going to be helpful? How are these punishments going to make any change, right? Like, he had a friend who was saying that, you know, being in jail was good. He had TV, he had food, he had shelter. So I think, yeah, I just wanted to share that thought.
Mm-hmm. And that makes me think of, I remember I was listening to a lot of prisoner abolition thinkers and listening to the concepts of rehabilitation and how oftentimes, you know, the criminal justice system has sometimes worked to not necessarily provide, or just may not completely provide, that rehabilitative element. And that's why we see things like recidivism, which is you go into jail and you come back into jail, and then there's a cycle. That trickle down cycle has that effect. And as we're talking about intergenerational trauma, is seeing, I mean, the last residential school ended in 1996. That's the year I was born, and I'm not that old, you know? And so it's kind of thinking about how the cycles, once the cycle is not shifted or shaken, abolished, or even, you know, dismantled in any sort, it just continues. The pain, the harm, the violence continues. And when we think about rehabilitating, we need to also question, to whose standards, for whom, and how, as a community, when we talk about justice, when we talk about more justice, more peace, at the center of justice, what does that look like? Does that mean punishment? Does that mean that they get pain? Or does that mean that there's learning, there's love, that we lead with love? And I think oftentimes when we look at these structures, it lacks that love. And not to say that, you know, we can't think about how we can be together by customizing what that love can look like if someone causes harm. That's not saying that we shouldn't, you know, think about ways that we can be together and be here for each other. But if we use standardized operations of executing punishment or rehabilitation, many, many people get left in the dark. So with that, do you have any expectations or hopes for those in community, whether it's older folks, political parties, people in authority positions, when it comes to race and racism?
Sorry, I feel like I'm talking so much.
Good, me too.
My hope is that people can uphold our beauty, our brilliance, our sophisticated, complex cultures and ways of life, our art, our people, even amongst all the dark and sinister truths that BIPOC people face. I performed this solo a few years ago about the disproportionate rates of suicide that Indigenous youth face in Canada. And when I was receiving feedback, someone asked me why I didn't end the piece in a happier, hopeful way. And I turned to them and said, you know, the hope might not be in this story. And sometimes that's the truth. And I want to be honest with you. But maybe the hope is that I, an Indigenous young person, am standing here strong and proud to tell you this story. And so often I feel like our beauty is right there in front of everyone, but they can only see our hurt and trauma. And this is something I talk about with my mom a lot, is finding that beauty, that brilliance amongst all this, because we live it every day. We are deep within these dark truths. And sometimes it is okay to sit in that and feel it, but I also think sometimes I wish people could see us for who we really are as well, which are beautiful people.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's so important to look at people holistically, is that when we start to coin people as holistically bad or holistically good, there's harm in that, because it diminishes and also erases the complexity and the depths of our existence. And I think when it comes to the complexity of that, that takes time. Is to be able to see these things is when you don't take the time to care, to extend that hand, and to be with and in community, then that's oftentimes not afforded. And I think the more times that we can have conversations like this, but also showcase our beauty, and that's in our essence, you know, for me, I'm like Black girl magic always. I think it's important for us to see who we are and how we are by being in community. And that's super important when doing that. Kisa?
I'm so sorry. My computer almost died, so your voice cut out. So could you repeat the question?
Yes. I was just saying that when it comes to expectations or hopes for community, to older folks or people in positions of power or political parties, what are your expectations when it comes to race and racism?
Yeah, I think my expectation is that they leave space for them to hear us. And I think coming from, like, my dad is Samoan and my mom is Canadian, I think sometimes, you know, having those conversations maybe with my mom's side of the family, which are older, and just kind of like having them maybe listen to experiences of what it's like to be a person of color, I think is so important. That way they can learn. And sometimes maybe I would be the only person of color they would interact with that day or maybe ever. So just listening to the experiences, I think, is really important.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And it's important with that is to diversify the spaces. You may not have people of color in your spaces, in your circles, but there's Google, there's books, and there's ways of educating yourself in different forms of people's experiences and racialized experience. It doesn't have to be necessarily knowing someone, which is great, and being able to cater to the needs, but also exposing yourself to the different types of knowledges, is exposing yourself to things that make you uncomfortable and understanding the why and why cultures operate in this way, to further understand. And as Selma was saying, check yourself, is to see where you're at, check your positionality. And with that, you can now choose to be active, to be an activist. Selma?
I guess my expectation or my hopes are that while maybe non-BIPOC people learn to educate themselves, but not at the expense of BIPOC mental health. So what I'm trying to say is, we live those experiences, we have those experiences, we have the knowledge, but talking about them all the time and having to educate people when they ask all the time, it can be very traumatic for a lot of people, having to constantly feel as though they are, oh, I need to know everything, like I need to be this like woke girl, so I need to be able to know everything so that if someone asks me, I can give them the information that they need. But we're not all like that, and the expectation that we are all like that is it's something I feel that is ingrained in our society. But also I hope people get more comfortable with having the dialogues that do make them uncomfortable, such as like with racism, and that they get comfortable with some good trouble, as John Lewis said. So that's what I have to say about that.
Yeah, and I completely agree with that. I think that it shouldn't be at our expense. I think a huge learning curve at the beginning of when I got involved in activism, I felt as though I needed to have all the answers. And because I'm that kind of person that feels like I need to always have the answers, but also because people expected that of me. And I think the more I get immersed with it, the more I can set boundaries and articulate that and have the vocabulary to articulate that, is to explain that I don't know. And if I don't know, don't expect that for me to know. Because when you expect me to know and you also don't know, now we're shifting the powers. Is that you are exploiting and capitalizing on my vulnerability at this point. And I think that the more we can be vulnerable with each other, and also find ways for us to be empowered with that vulnerability, is when beauty can happen, change can happen, allyship, and not performative, but almost dismantlers. As Dr. Lisa Gunderson always says, is, do you want to be a dismantler, a white dismantler? Is to step beyond that performative allyship and actually be here. So that resumes our talk today for the International Anti-Elimination of Racism talk. We have the youth here. Youth Standing Up Against Racism is our theme. For more information about anything we said or learning more about advocacy within Vancouver Island, check out the VIHRC website. To learn more about the great panelists that are here, we will have their links, not links, but their information below. Thank you so much. Thank you so much to all of you. And I look forward to the change that you will do from this conversation.